is urban agriculture something that's sustainable? And I mean, let's break it down into those three parts you used, starting with economically speaking then. How economically viable, in your opinion, and I guess equitable as well, how economically viable and equitable is urban agriculture in your opinion?
I think of all of those different kinds of urban agriculture projects, the only projects that are really actually economically viable in a, I won't say a free market, but a relatively free market, are the commercial high-end projects. And those projects are largely producing salad greens and herbs. And so sure, they're economically viable, but they're not really doing food production. I mean, there's a nutritional value to salad greens, absolutely, but it's not really producing a ton of calories. The rest of the projects really aren't economically viable. They often rely on donated time or on grant funding, which is especially now not always super reliable. So yeah, that's another problem with economic viability. And I also wonder, even for the grant money, even if you had a steady supply of grant money to an urban agriculture project, is that the best use of that money? In other words, is that really, if the goal is not to produce tomatoes, if the goal is food security, I'm not sure that subsidizing urban agriculture projects in cities is really the way to go. I really am not, just because that also can provide an excuse for the state, and by the state I mean municipal governments, state level or regional governments, and national level governments. It can be the state sort of rolling back social services. The state can say, well, we gave you this grant for the urban garden, and now you can grow vegetables for yourself, and so we don't owe you anything anymore. There's also, as far as economically viable, there's real differential access to grant funding. So in the United States, there's this big push to replace a federal program that provides essentially surplus produce to the poorest schools to feed children that otherwise wouldn't have breakfast. That's a long-running federal program that both subsidizes US agriculture and also provides much-needed calories for kids. There's a push to replace that with school gardens and farm to school programs. But we find when we look at those closely that it's often the wealthiest schools that have the easiest time building those programs and sustaining them and having access to grants. It's not the children who really most need that fresh produce who are getting it from these farm to school programs. So yeah, I don't think if you look at the economically viable, it really flies. But, and I think we can talk about this later too, we've made certain decisions in certain societies now that certain things that aren't economically viable, we still want as part of our lives. And I think COVID especially has really made people to some extent believe in the state again to solve some problems, or at least to tackle them, if not to solve them. So urban ag might be something that is not viable in a free market, but that we should subsidize. First of all, I've been trying to work with Harvard University to figure out a building to put a green roof on. And it's really difficult, even if Harvard wanted to do one green roof on one of its, 60 or so buildings in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it would be really tough because most of the buildings either A, don't have a roof that's flat, number one, or two, the roof just can't support the weight. I mean, if you want to grow, first of all, vegetables, if you want to grow annuals, you need a certain amount of soil, but especially if you're like me and you want to grow perennials, and we can get into that distinction and why it's important energy-wise later if you want. If you want to grow perennials, you need at least a foot of soil, and soil holds a lot of water. So now you need a roof that can hold a foot of soil plus all the water load, plus if you're in Massachusetts, a snow load. That's a lot of weight. And so the only place we found within, a quarter mile of campus is an old parking garage that was essentially over-engineered, was overbuilt, and we could maybe put a garden on the roof of that. So there's a structural problem, and I mean that in the etymological sense, certain structures, most structures in cities can't support that weight. But let's just say, for sake of argument, we could put, I think you used Milan and Kuala Lumpur. Let's just say that there were buildings that could support those projects on the roof. I'm not convinced that that is really going to change the ecology of the globe. In other words, I don't think there's enough food production capability to relieve other parts of the world. In other words, it's not like we're going to make, I don't know, 1 square mile of gardens in downtown Milan. Great, so we've saved 1 square mile of land somewhere else from being tilled up. I don't know, that's a huge contribution. And I know that the resources needed to transform those roofs into urban agriculture projects would be enormous. And then as far as food production, we know from, I mean, I think the best case is probably Havana. Havana, at its maximum food production during what the Cubans call the special period, I think it was 60% of Havana's fruits and vegetables were produced in Havana, within the city limits. That is an absolutely amazing level. And obviously that's not just roofs, that's vacant lots too, but let's say it was just roofs. That's an enormous level, but that's with, first of all, an enormous amount of resources from the state to help people do that individually. It's under a lot of coercion and duress, and it's also in a tropical climate. So maybe in Havana, you can make a huge difference ecologically, but Boston, boy, it's a lot of snow in Boston and gray days. I'm not sure.
Figuring that both of those answers are quite negative.
Sorry.
Your final circle is obviously the social circle. Are you more hopeful with that circle?
I am. I can happily report that social circle is a more positive one for me. I think if people are looking to urban ag projects of all these different kinds, residential, collective, nonprofit, institutional, if they're looking to those projects to solve a food production crisis or to be economically viable, they can't be historians, because anybody who's looked at this in historical light has seen the last 100 years are pretty clear. Only under duress or in extreme circumstances can you really do a lot of food production. And you have to really look hard to find urban agriculture projects where food production is the primary goal and the primary outcome. However, there are enormous potential spillover effects, positive spillover effects, social effects that come out of these projects. And I think I would liken it to recycling. So, when I take out the garbage, I say I got to take out the garbage, but I'm actually, what am I doing? I'm taking out garbage, and I'm taking out a little blue box here in New York State that has a symbol on the side with 3 arrows going in sort of a triangular circle, let's say. I'm sure you've all seen that symbol. Nobody had seen that symbol 40 years ago. My mother tells me about how when she was a kid, they would go to McDonald's and then they would be driving down the road, and when they were done with their meal, they would just throw the waste, the paper out the window, throw the plastic cups out the window. That little recycling symbol has had a huge impact. I don't think for plastics specifically, it's had a huge impact. I mean, I think there's a lot of research that shows that all this effort recycling plastics doesn't really go anywhere. However, even if me saving all the plastic bottles, as I dutifully do, like most of the people on this call, that makes me think about recycling in other parts of my life. So when I leave a room, I turn off the light. When it's relatively warm outside, I might just put out the fan rather than running the air conditioning. So I think there's enormous possible spillover benefits. Those benefits are not just in changing individual people's thought, they're also making community. So these urban agriculture projects, let's think about the Fenway Garden Society. You have to be a resident of Boston to have one of those. And most people are from not too far away. There's also a commitment by that garden project, like in many of these projects, to have a diverse group of people, and diverse racially and ethnically, but also class-wise. That might be the only place in Boston, or the only place in some of those people's lives where they meet people that are really different from them. And I think in this era, especially political polarization, that's really important. It's really important to go to a place where the person next to you in the next plot over has different ideas from you or has different problems from you. So the social benefits, I think, if you're looking to produce a whole ton of tomatoes, go to California and buy a farm, and you're going to produce a ton of tomatoes. If you're looking to produce community, you're not going to find it in the middle of the Central Valley in California, but you might find it in a community garden. So I think if your goal is changing food production, maybe urban ag isn't the way to do it sustainably. But if your goal is to change people who can then change food production, it's not a bad way.
Yeah. Is, this necessity for a sustainable action to be economically viable, is that sometimes a myth, you think, that people are kind of manipulating to stall change? And secondly, is it maybe something, as you were suggesting a little bit, that we maybe need to abandon, in the sense of like a greater good?
I think I'm going to channel Noam Chomsky here for a second. I hope no one on the call is disturbed by that. It's difficult to point to a successful part of at least the American economy, but the global economy as well, that hasn't been massively subsidized by some government or another. So the internet is the easiest thing to point at right now. We wouldn't have the internet without massive long-term spending on the part of the US government to make that technology possible. I think since, let's say, the 1970s, there's been a huge push among certain intellectuals, especially economists, to say the free market, totally unregulated, is the way to go. Government is, in the words of Ronald Reagan, the problem, not the solution. And there shouldn't be any sort of regulation or subsidies to anything at all, except for the high-tech sector, but we'll disguise that through NIH grants or whatever. If you'd asked me 18 months ago what I thought the future was for a broad swath of voters in most countries supporting government action to solve problems, I would have said it's pretty low. Neoliberalism has taken over. It's embedded in people's brains. They think the government is the enemy. The one thing they can partially control is the enemy. However, this COVID moment may have really changed that. I mean, I see this as a massive blow to neoliberalism, because anyone who said the government should stay out and the private market, the market economy alone can solve problems and the government messes it up. I mean, they had to have been asleep until yesterday for the last 18 months. I mean, there's just no one who can say that anymore. And get with a straight face. I'm wondering where all my libertarian friends have gone. Most of them have gotten their shots paid for by the US taxpayer, which amuses the hell out of me. So to go from that really big level and go to the smaller level, I think people are now open to the idea that everything doesn't, first of all, to the myth of economically viable. Things are often economically viable only after they've been supported by the state for decades, or they're monopolies. I mean, I happily am in a guild where you can't compete with me for a job unless you have a PhD, which is great. I mean, limited monopolies are awesome if you're inside of them. I think people are realizing that this is a myth. The economically viable thing is a myth. And also, even if it's true, there are certain things that are really important that exist. And, art museums, I don't think they're economically viable. I'm pretty committed to art museums. But I think urban ag, if we're looking to justify it on the basis of this can compete in the market, it's not going to happen. If we're looking to say this is going to be the solution to hunger problems, that's a myth, I think, as much as I love them. But it might be something that has all these positive spillover effects that make it worth it to subsidize.
Are you saying that subsidy economy is the only future?
For urban agriculture specifically?
I believe so, yes.
I think there's a big enough sector of the, let's say, the charitable sector that it can still exist. And I mean charitable, either grants to urban agriculture projects or let's say a company that owns a lot in a downtown area and lets people do urban ag on it, municipalities who decide to make it available for citizens, people who volunteer their time. I mean, if you think about a church, sure, the church owns the land, but people still have to volunteer the time to do the urban ag project. So there's definitely a spectrum here. It doesn't have to be either. It has to survive on its own in the free market, or it's all volunteer labor. I think there's a spectrum. I think it also really depends on population density in these areas. It depends on available land that's near to the city. I think the comparison between, I don't know, a city like Berlin and a city like Havana, there's a huge difference there in government support, potentially. There's a huge difference in climate. So I'm hesitant to like say it won't work anywhere, but I think we have to constantly ask ourselves, what are the actual goals? Are we trying to produce community? Okay, then maybe it's worth it to produce not that many tomatoes if we're producing community. But if the goal is to respond to climate change, and that's the overall goal, man, skip the urban agriculture projects in downtown Boston and build me a seawall around Dorchester, which, like Battery Park, is very much in danger of being flooded by 15-foot tidal surge. So we have to, I don't want to be too economical, but return on investment, it's really important. And that's not just in money terms, but in goal terms.
So I just wanted to ask your point of view about the kind of discriminatory and social inequalities that are apparent in urban agriculture, and I guess agriculture and food in general, and what ways we can maybe combat these. Can they be ameliorated to the correct extent?
Yeah, it's tough. I think there's a paper on urban ag that talks about white faces in black and brown places. There's a certain messianic strain to alternative agriculture and urban agriculture, where it's white people who sort of have the answers that are going to go to black and brown communities and save them, right? There's this sort of savior complex. And it's, first of all, it's super condescending, because if you think about, at least in the United States, black and brown communities, those are people, you know, if you think Puerto Ricans in the United States, people that have a deep knowledge of agriculture, and you're sort of talking down on them and explaining how to plant things. African Americans, who draw on a very long tradition of not only field agriculture, but also kitchen gardens. That there wasn't something that was a hobby. It was a necessity to have enough food. And then often on the West Coast, but not only, Asian immigrants who come from peasant societies where food production was not only something they had to do, but also an art, and especially in really tough environments. So this white American savior complex can be super condescending and really off-putting and put a chill on these projects. It also goes back to the idea of equity. Who runs these projects? Who organizes them? What is the management? How much are these community gardens run by grants from foundations that are largely white boards? How much are they involving the local people on the decision making? So in St. Louis, there's this project where this group is going to plant all of this corn, and they just think this is an awesome idea. They're really psyched about it. But then the neighbors in this neighborhood that's primarily a neighborhood of color didn't want the corn there, because it provides opportunities for people to hide and drug deals, and they were really angry about that. So there has to be a really meaningful engagement of the community in the project. It can't just be imposed on people. I'd also go back to the grant part of this, because there's been this neoliberal rollback of the state, because the state is, at least until the COVID epidemic in the 40 years prior, said, okay, it's going to be the charitable sector and the nonprofit sector that's going to tackle a lot of social problems. We're getting out of the providing a safety net, at least in the United States, Great Britain to a great degree as well, some of the European countries to varying degrees. As the states pulled back, you have this grant funding mechanism in place, but then it's ferocious competition for crumbs, and it's the groups that have the most leisure time to write up grants and the social capital. First of all, knowing the people who are in the foundations, but also being able to put those together and tailor it. Those groups have the advantage, and by and large, those are white-led groups. So there's a real, even in the charitable sector, there's this huge racial inequality that exists. So again, not to be too down on it, but we really have to think about where the money is coming from if it's not coming from the government.
Yeah, so it's thinking a lot about where the money is coming from and thinking about correct and, I guess, moral and value-led integration. I think I understand. I just, because I'm aware of time, I want to maximize your expertise. I know that you have a vast amount of knowledge on just like the history of food and agriculture in general. And since urban agriculture doesn't seem to be a shining light as much as maybe it appears in the beginning, what is your take on the future of human nourishment? And what projects, systems, mechanisms do you think we need to embrace to be sustainable?
So I had my own residential urban agriculture project next to my condominium last year, and I like did a back of the envelope calculation and figured that each of my tomatoes cost roughly $17, but they were delicious. So there are other things that we get out of agriculture than just food. I think that's really important. I'm a food historian, and I think one of the best titles I ever stole from my advisor was "More Than Just a Meal." Food is more than just a meal. For the future, I think it's easy for me as a historian to look back at the 1970s and all of these Malthusian worries, right? People are terrified that population is going to outstrip food production, and there's going to be this global chaos. The population bomb, the population explosion, I think these are some of the names of the books. And ultimately, it didn't happen. The Green Revolution sort of saves us, right? We have this massive increase in efficiency of food production with fertilizer, artificial fertilizer, with new strains, with genetic modification. And so it's really difficult for me to be a Malthusian and say, well, I'm worried about the future, and if we produce more food, we'll get more people. But I have to say that there is some limit to arable land. There is some limit to increasing food production. I mean, you can have wheat that's shorter and has larger heads to a certain extent, but not an infinite extent. I mean, I remember enough of calculus to know that there's a limit at some point. So I worry a little bit. I think we've done a great job globally reducing global hunger, but then we've added a ton more people, and not just more people, but also people like me that drain a ton of resources. I mean, my huge computer screen is now making the kilowatt thing in the basement go like this. So that's one worry. If I can point out something I'm hopeful about, it's perennial agriculture. So this is thinking about urban agriculture projects and not just seeing vegetables like tomatoes. It's seeing vegetables like asparagus, where you plant it once and it just comes up every year. Or things like currants. I have currant bushes out back. I don't have to do anything every year. Annual vegetables are like toddlers. You have to watch them all the time, and they need a lot of work. And they can't do anything by themselves. Perennials are like teenagers. They can be annoying. You gotta put some time into them, but they can do things by themselves. They don't need constant care. So I'm a big perennial enthusiast. And that's not just perennials like nut trees and asparagus, but also things like perennial grains. There's a place out in Kansas, the United States, the Land Institute, and they've been working for 40 years to back cross wheat with one of wheat's relatives that's a perennial grain, to try to get a perennial grass that just comes up every year. You don't have to till, that produces big seed heads. This would be an enormous advance. I mean, of course, I go back and worry about a huge population explosion if we have more food, but I don't know. So there are things that worry me. Historically, I don't want to get too set on the idea of a population explosion, but also some points of progress. And just the fact we're having this conversation that we wouldn't have had 20 years ago. That's progress.